when you die, maybe there is a pearly gate and a St. Peter. And I don't want him to tell me that, Olle, why didn't you speak up? You saw and understood like Arthur Firstenberg. Why didn't you speak up? And I did speak up. So maybe he will say, Olle, you did your best. You failed, but you did your best anyhow, That's enough for me.
My guest today is Professor Olle Johansson. He's a Swedish neuroscientist and a former associate professor at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm. He's internationally recognized for his pioneering research on the biological effects of electromagnetic fields, including their potential impact on human health. His work has contributed to the scientific discourse on electrohypersensitivity and the broader implications of EMF exposure. In addition to his academic contributions, Johansson has been an advocate for increased awareness and precaution regarding EMF exposure. He's participated in numerous public lectures and discussions on the subject. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to appear on this program. Thank you.
I have a number of questions here today, and just wanted to mention briefly, my audience is generally composed of people like myself who are electrically sensitive and have been, in my case, for some time, 40 years. Others are just learning, just establishing a correlation between their exposure to different types of fields and their health. The other half of my followers are maybe not completely sold on the physiologic effects of EMF, and that's fine. They want to take a precautionary approach, however, until or unless it is ever proven to be without harm. They want to reduce exposures for themselves or their families. And I've got a number of questions, so with your permission, we'll get right into it with the first question.
Okay.
Is there a known safe level of exposure to the type of radio frequency radiation that is used for wireless communication, such as Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and cell phones? Is there a known safe level of exposure? And then perhaps you could also compare and contrast that with the types of fields that exist in nature.
This is a very important question. 1997, at the trade union meeting here in Stockholm, I proposed that we should have a hygienic safety exposure level, because in Sweden we have such hygienic, law-abiding exposure levels for anything. And I said we should have it also for the man-made artificial electromagnetic fields. And I said the only level we can put our names behind would be the natural background. And then I remember I had a very strong opponent who was present at that meeting. And then he said the following: well, generally I never trust what Johansson says, but this time he is completely right.
Oh my.
And I was, of course, very honored by that comment. And he pointed to that the natural fields, they are so much, much, much lower when we look on exposure levels. And just to immediately compare, if you can imagine that you remove everything where you are, including power lines, radio, television, everything that is electromagnetic exposure, and only keep the third generation mobile telephony, and ask yourself, how much more of such exposure do I get compared to natural background? And then the increase of only the third generation, and you remember we are already now in the fourth and fifth generation, but the third generation is a quintillion times higher than the comparable natural background. And that's a 1 with 18 zeros behind. And I often tell people, imagine that tomorrow the outdoor temperature would have increased a quintillion times. Then not only your town or city would disappear in flames, but the entire planet would go up immediately, like the head on a match. These increases compared to natural background, I don't know the proper English word. Are they colossal? Are they astronomical? Are they biblical even? I mean, they are huge, huge. But since we can't see the radio frequent fields or whatever fields we're talking about, except visible light, then we don't see the problems, if you tell me like that. And that's also interesting to compare, because even the third generation, and especially if we put everything back, they are also artificial in the sense that that kind of fields have never existed here before. So mathematically, the increase is actually infinite. It's more than a quintillion times. And the lowest exposure increase that we can measure is from power-frequent magnetic fields, which is a long name for household electricity. And the increase compared to natural 50, 60 hertz fields is only 100 million times. So that's a small increase. And of course, it's also huge when you really think about it.
And you mentioned the power line frequencies. When I think of the natural electromagnetic environment of the Earth, the surface of the Earth itself is negatively charged and the ionosphere is positively charged. And we live in this direct current voltage gradient that's vertically oriented. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And if you're in a normal home, what's considered a normal home today, you have wiring that goes in three different directions, left to right, in and out, and up and down. And they're not direct current fields. They're alternating currents. So they switch back and forth in polarity many, many times a second. Is that right to think about it that way?
Well, it is. And also in the wiring, at least in Sweden, we have a lot of what we call electromagnetic disturbances. Sometimes you see the word dirty electricity, ranging all the way up to the high radio frequency signals. And also here, the power lines are often used for something called power line communication, where you use the lines using radio frequency signals to transport information or get information, like from so-called smart meters, etc. So there is a mixture of different frequencies, from the extremely low frequent ones to very low frequent ones, and upwards to radio frequent and very high radio frequency signals. And none of this was around like 150 years ago. Nothing of this. So it is a dramatic change, as you say. And the fields, the geomagnetic fields, they are static. They are strong. Here in Sweden, for instance, we measure around 50 microteslas, but they're static. And of course, any species that couldn't withstand that exposure, they are gone. So all the remaining species have adapted to these geomagnetic fields. Also from outer space, we get, for instance, 50 hertz signals and other type of radio frequency signals, but they are so extremely weak. You need colossal antennas, like a Jodl Bank and so on, to even pick them up. And you need amplifiers in the electronics, etc., because they are so very, very weak. And again, all the species that are left on the planet, including humans, we have adapted to this. And then suddenly, for commercial and very fun reasons, you switch on like this: radio, television, you have mobile phones, you have wireless internet, etc., etc., etc. And the question is basically, can we take all of this and at these colossal exposure levels?
Yes, and there are some fundamental differences in terms of polarity, or in terms of coherence, in terms of pulse modulation. So none of the sources that I'm aware of have any of those characteristics, and those make
Exactly.
this type of synthetic EMF really, really new. So you mentioned Prior to 150 years ago, we had none of this. Is there anything that happened from a noteworthy perspective physiologically to our species 150 years ago when, I believe you're referring to the telegraph, began to be operated? Were there any effects?
Well, there was quite a number of effects actually reported by people that started to use, as you say, the telegraphic systems or the early radio systems and whatnot. And they reported headaches, for instance, nausea. They had problems with memory capacity, concentration capacity, and so on. And at first, people were looked upon as just imagining this, but rather soon, medical doctors and scientists saw and realized that it could be an effect of the very new electromagnetic field exposures, and more regulations came about. And for instance, as you know, for radar, from the beginning, you can expose yourself to any radar exposure if you wanted to, but today it's extremely shielded, and safety precautions in civil aviation, for instance, as in military aviation or on ships and boats and wherever you use it. So that has changed a lot, I would say. And maybe in the future, and I often think about when I go to an exhibition here on the West Coast, where you have a wristwatch that was painted with radioactive paint, so it glow in the dark. And they have one of these, and it is in a lead box. And you can take a Geiger counter and listen to the radiation. Now we are talking about ionizing radiation from an isotope. And when I stand there and do these measurements, I often think, maybe in 50 years' time, they will have another case next to it with a cell phone in it. And you would measure the radio frequency fields, and you would sort of smile and say, oh, they didn't understand better, you know. And we are at that point here. Maybe we don't understand better, and we allow ourselves, our children, grandchildren, to be exposed, and not to be forgotten, of course. Dogs, cats, wildlife, livestock, plants, bacteria, whatever, everything is exposed. And maybe it isn't the best of ideas to do it. And but at the same time, I would be very happy to sort of raise the green flag and tell everyone it's safe. But today, that would mean that tens of thousands of scientific, peer-review-based articles in journals, scientific journals, all would have to be wrong at the same time. And that has never happened before in science history, you know. But hopefully it is all wrong, and that all these gadgets are safe. But so far, we haven't been able to show that they are safe. And therefore, we have always recommend the precautionary principle, better safe than sorry. And some have actually listened very carefully to me and others. And among them are, for instance, the manufacturers of these type of gadgets, the operators, the World Health Organization, the Radiation Protection Authorities, and above all the world's insurance and reinsurance companies. They do not take any form of responsibility for these safe gadgets. And in a way, that's more telling than any test tube experiment or whatever I could show to you, because they have drawn a conclusion. And I remember 2002 in London, I was present at the conference, and it was quite public actually, and it was related in newspapers afterwards. And at the conference, you had, for instance, Lloyd's UK, which is the biggest insurance dealer, and from Switzerland, you have Swiss Re, which is the biggest reinsurance dealer, and from Sweden was a small company called If Scandia, etc., etc. And every such insurance company said that for them, the question wasn't whether the cell phone radiation was dangerous or not. They knew it was dangerous. The question was only, in the future, who is going to pay for this party? When people start craving compensations for illnesses, maybe tumors, maybe fertility defects, etc. And they didn't want to pay for that. And they were 100% open about it. They didn't try to hide this fact.
There is a website, Cellular Phone Task Force, and Arthur Furstenberg maintained that for a number of years. He has an excellent, I think, packet that you can download called the radio wave packet. And it gives certain research that's been shown just infinitesimal amounts of, for example, RF radiation can have an effect on bacteria and many more things like the disturbance of the blood-brain barrier and the ability to modulate the heart, either increasing the rate, decreasing, or in some cases stopping. And some of these things have been known for more than 50 years. There's also something
That's
interesting
true.
in that. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, for instance, leakage of the blood-brain barrier. And since I am by trade a neuroscientist, I can tell you, you don't want to have any leakage of the blood-brain barrier. But for instance, a group in Lund here in Sweden, they showed that you only needed 1 minute of cell phone radiation exposure to your head. And at an exposure level that was 5,000 times below what you are supposed to withstand. So it was a very weak exposure compared to the colossal levels we talked about before. And after 1 minute, you got a dramatic leakage of the blood-brain barrier. And to me, to be honest, I'm surprised that public authorities haven't reacted to this, like health authorities, radiation protection boards, governments, parliaments, etc. But of course, again, the insurance and reinsurance companies, they reacted very early, realizing that, oh no way we can take any form of responsibility for these type of exposures. And the sad thing is that when you go to a shop, like here in Stockholm, you buy a cell phone, the person in the shop doesn't tell you anything about this. There is no radio wave packet that you get along with science and questions and so on. They just sell it to you as being safe. And I have kind of amused myself by interviewing people in these shops, asking them about risks and danger, and I see they don't even understand the question. It's not on their chart at all. So they say, oh, it's safe. Why shouldn't it be safe? And then I try to tell them a little bit, but it's not always that they are so very interested. And may I also tell you a story? I think it's like 2 years ago. I was here in Stockholm. I was riding a commuter train, and when I came aboard, there was a very posh lady, around 60, 65 years of age, and she was fiddling around with her smartphone. And since no one knows who I am, I always take the possibility to educate and inform. So I said to her, oh, sorry, do you know that the World Health Organization in Geneva in Switzerland has actually cancer classified the radiation your phone is using to communicate with the antennas, the base stations, and get information back? And she got very angry with me and told me in Swedish some rather bad words. I could basically go to a hot place and etc. etc.
Oh.
And I said, please stop. I hear you and I respect your reaction, but you have a smartphone. Couldn't you please Google WHO, brain tumor, and mobile phone radiation? And she did, and went silent for like a minute or two, and then slowly she looked up at me and said, oh, I'm so sorry, sir. You were completely right. It's all here. And now I get very angry again, she said, not at you, but at our Swedish parliament, government, health authorities. You see, I am not only a mother, I'm also a grandmother. And a week ago, I bought a new smartphone for my 14-year-old granddaughter. And now I regret it. Why didn't the government and parliament tell me what you are telling me now? And at that time, during our journey, I had to leave the train. So I don't know how it sort of ended. But hopefully she continued being angry and continued maybe addressing these questions with local as well as national politicians, health officers, etc., because it is important to draw conclusions from this as the manufacturers, the operators, the insurance companies, and so on already did more than 25 years ago. So I would say the general public are kind of kept in a legal darkness. And they will wake up, of course, in the future when someone craves compensation because of something, leakage of the blood-brain barrier, whatever, and realizing that, oh, the players abandoned the ship more than 25, 30 years ago. So I need to address my complaints to the government and parliament. And with all due respect, we know how successful that will be, So.
Yes, it sounds like the most effect was what you had on that woman in the public transport, reaching people one at a time.
Yeah.
And they are resistant.
Yeah.
I do find that as well. So that's a wonderful success with
And
that one.
I say, as you said before, I say, as you said before, I don't want to impose any ideas or conclusions or whatever. I always tell people, do your own homework, read. You have a laptop or a stationary computer or a cell phone or whatever with Google, start there, compare, think again, think more, and then draw a conclusion for yourself and for your family and for your loved ones. Start there,
And I think if I'm not mistaken, this blood-brain barrier compromise has been known since at least, I think it was the 1980s with an American biologist, Alan Frey. Is that right? Or was it known before then?
Yeah, that's correct. Even before that, 1977, he came to Finland and he lectured together with other scientists about that you can use microwaves, the same type of microwaves you use for cell phone communication, to open this mysterious blood-brain barrier. And 1977, there were no such systems around. No one understood that Finland soon would change its name into Nokia-land, with Nokia consumer electronics being the big company in Finland. But that was years to come. And so no one sort of stood up and said, oh, we can't go into that business adventure now. That came later on. But it's interesting to see that, of course, experts from, for instance, the insurance industry, they have their ears to the ground listening for warning signals that could be later on colossal threats to their economy. And in this case, they did listen very well. And they have listened to me as well,
So we'll leave behind the damage to the blood-brain barrier and how long that's been known. I'll make a few parting shots, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it was then proven by researchers a couple of decades after that the kind of pulse-modulated radio frequency radiation could actually do a much more effective job than the regular, what you would have in your microwave oven, all of which leads me horrified when I see young people putting wireless earbuds in their ears, because I don't think those are tested, correct me if I'm wrong, to make sure they're not destroying the blood-brain barrier.
Everything you say is completely right. Indeed, yes. And I have the same thoughts and reflections as you have every time I see young or old people and children as well, with earbuds like this or with other gadgets that they voluntarily, and they love them, of course. They want to use them, but they expose themselves to something that a lot of levels of society have turned their back on for decades ago,
Yeah. Do you own a cell phone?
I have a stationary phone, but I don't carry it around. I have no need for any mobility. So no. And I also have this laptop I'm sitting with here. It's also stationary. I don't carry it around. And if you meet me in Stockholm, you will see and identify me very easily. I don't carry these gadgets, and I don't carry my freezer or fridge or vacuum cleaner with me. I don't have the need to vacuum clean out on the streets, and I don't have the need to make any phone calls. It's enough sitting here taking all the calls from the stationary phone, as everyone used to do before. But I do respect that people, well, think they need this mobility, but I hope that some company, and of course I would love if it would be a Swedish company that would come up with tomorrow's green, human, and environmental friendly technology for wireless communication. And so I hope someone will invent this, or maybe it's actually impossible. You cannot have these kind of exposures. So maybe tomorrow we will see life on this planet taking steps backwards into older technology, but in a new form. So let's see what will happen. So
You said it well about you don't need to take your vacuum cleaner with you or
no,
other appliances. And what
no,
I say to people is the only thing this horrific radio frequency radiation fog gives us is location independent voice and data. And is that
yeah,
worth taking the risk for potentially putting our children and our grandchildren at risk, as well as birds and bees and all of life? So I'll just leave that
yeah.
as an editorial comment. And I want to ask you, you stress, I think,
Before we leave that, may I
yeah,
just add that scientists have looked very clearly and neatly into the mobility issue. And when people were interviewed, the mobility came very, very far down on their priority list. And when you see people, most of them do not run around. They actually sit or stand and do whatever they need to do. And of course, the mobility lies within that you can bring your mental vacuum cleaner, you can call it, on board a train or whatever, and still be connected. But I'm not impressed, because if you look around in societies today, in Sweden or elsewhere, all the old type questions are still unsolved. Um, so I'm not so very impressed by this computing capacity that people carry around. Maybe it would be better if they stayed and started to think and use the brain. So,
well, this will be a bridge too far for many people watching or listening to us. But do we know for a fact that using a computer, even one that's wired, as opposed to using a wireless Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, do we know that that has no physiologic effect?
oh no, on the contrary, of course, any form of computer, as we call them, like my laptop here, is just a bigger version of any type of radio frequent and other frequency domains that you're exposed to. So maybe again you need to come up with other solutions for human as well as environmental friendly technologies, and that would include every gadget that we would think about, including smart meters, baby alarms, power lines, television sets, radio receivers and transmitters, and so on. I mean, the list is very, very long. And of course, these are, how should I say, these are possibilities for any smart engineer and business person. Just imagine to sell all the cell phones once again, but in a friendly format, or all the wireless turning back to cabled. I read the mileage, for instance, in an ordinary apartment house. It's just colossal, the number of miles of cables that you would need. And in Sweden, we have a company called ABB Cables. They would be very happy if we
Yeah.
turned wired again. They would be very happy. So there is always an upside to the downside. And again, when people then report that the mobility is not a big issue, really, there are other characters of their cell phone or laptop that is more important. Maybe you can have a future compromise, whatever it will look like. But before arriving at it, I would argue that we still need to go a bit deeper scientifically in studying the effect, not only on humans, but on all the other 8.7 million species that are around on this planet. And so there is a bit more to be done. But others, like you mentioned, Arthur Firstenberg, who recently, unfortunately, left us, he meant, and I agree, that the number of facts we have already on the table is enough for a moratorium and enough to urge the commercial side to come up with other gadgets, other solutions for communication. So I agree with him as well. But also, as a scientist, I am curious to see a bit more regarding the effects at different biological levels.
You seem like you've gone out of your way to help a number of electrically sensitive people. You've been doing this for this type of work for many decades. They probably come and find you. Maybe knock on your front door sometimes. I don't know.
Yeah, they do. Yes.
Do they? Do they, in fact? I noticed that you stress that the sensitivity is a functional disability. Hypersensitivity is a functional disability. Why do you stress that?
Well, from the beginning, and that goes back to the late 70s and early 80s. In the early 80s, the first subjects were identified and reported. The first electrohypersensitive, or at that time they were called electrical allergy patients, came from Norway and the United States. But soon you would find them all over the planet. And in the beginning, they were looked upon as some kind of patient with an illness. But such an illness, scientists and medical doctors were unable to identify what kind of illness it was. And more, it was realized, and I will come back to that, but it was realized that they did react to the artificial exposures. And like here in Sweden, the introduction of the personal computers, which came in the early 80s, meant that a number of persons started to describe skin problems, rashes, irritations, pricking pain, swelling, redness, etc. And it's so fascinating because people had got these personal computers, and of course they were not so sophisticated as they are today, but they were fun. People loved working with them, And for instance, switchboards, they used them, and secretaries got them as word processors and so on. And people did not at all tie their subjective sensations to the gadget. No, they looked around where they lived and worked, thinking maybe I have another detergent for my clothes or another soap for my face, or I'm stressing, etc., etc., And people were looking really into what was the real culprit, and they didn't understand it could maybe be the computer. But then people started to notice that in the evening, when they got back home and didn't have the computer around them any longer, it got slightly better until the morning. When they came back to the work, it was something in the work environment They couldn't identify it, but it was something there. Also, over the weekend, they got even much better. And when they had holiday for a few weeks, they were really fine, But as soon as they came back to the workplace, sat down by the personal computer, started to work, then the problems came, and they started again looking around. But more and more people then also started to look at the computer, thinking, could it be this fun, fantastic machine? Is that the one that is causing the troubles here? Then more and more the discussions were concentrated on the actual computer. And then the general idea of the functional impairment came about. And one of the ministers, he was actually asked if an electrohypersensitive person, if he or she should be regarded as a normal, healthy individual. And he said, no, they are not. They have a lot of problems when they are exposed. And then he was asked, do they have an identifiable illness? And he said, no, they are not having an illness. They are not patients. And in Sweden, at least, then you only have a third final category, namely a disability or functional impairment. And he said, yes, that is exactly what this is about. And the national and international handicap laws and regulations apply to 100% to electrohypersensitive people without any exceptions. And from then on, people with electrohypersensitivity, they were identified as having a functional impairment. And remember, nowadays, the term has changed. So now it's called a functional variation and so on. There are other terms to it. That kind of also eased the situation for the electrohypersensitive, but also for other categories like medical doctors, because they didn't have to search for an illness that wasn't there. And I always recommended that those days. I said to people that if you need to go to a medical doctor, don't tell them that you suspect that the computer is causing this problem, that the computer screen is causing this. Just tell them, I have these symptoms, and you, please, dear doctor, you tell me what kind of illness I have. And the medical doctors couldn't. They tried, they looked in all their textbooks, and they were thinking of things, but no, it wasn't any classical illness like dermatological illness and so on. Some people started to talk about the electrohypersensitive people, and that was in the early days, that they were mentally deranged, or they were imagining things, and a lot of sort of explanation, Pavlovian conditioning. And then finally they arrived at a very interesting explanation, namely that it's actually your fault, because when you do an interview or write an article or a television program or radio program, then people start to think, oh, maybe I'm a bit also electrohypersensitive, and that is called a mass media driven psychosis. And even I remember I thought, interesting. And since I'm a scientist, I also thought, well, that's easy to control, to check. And instead of taking humans, we took rats and exposed them exactly the same. And to make a long story short, in spite of the facts that rats don't listen to radio, they don't watch television, they don't read newspapers, they still got the same cellular and molecular reaction patterns as the electrohypersensitive people. So that completely ruled out the mass media-driven psychosis. But you see, there have been a lot of home-cooked explanations trying to get rid of these people, but since the year 2000, they are very officially recognized as a functional impairment, and they are protected by the United Nations Special Human Rights Acts for people with functional impairments.
So it's not, well, neither one of us are medical doctors, and we don't give healthcare or medical advice, I'm sure. But with regard to the people that you've met and the situations you're talking about with this functional disability, is there anything other than avoidance that that helps people?
No, up to today, well, I will come back to that. But first, let me say that avoidance in the form of distance to the exposure source or shielding yourself or both.
Or
That's
removing
the
the source?
accessibility measures. Sorry?
Or removing the source?
Of course, but most often the sources are not easily removed, like a base station for telecom communication and so on. But you're right, if you can remove it, and people do that, of course, but distance and or shielding, then of course people, and I have had many discussions, very interesting, regarding your general lifestyle factors. If you drink a lot of alcohol and use a lot of drugs, and you smoke a lot and so on, it's a good idea to also remove these exposures as well, and maybe start looking at what you eat and what you drink, and try to become a better version of yourself. And many people have very interesting ideas about that, but one has to be honest and say those ideas are more of a speculative nature or in hypotheses. They have not reached the level of theory, or even less so being hardcore facts. So I'm always a bit hesitant to give advice regarding your lifestyle factors in general. But for the shielding and the distance or removal, definitely yes.
Yeah, avoidance is it's difficult sometimes because people don't even know what their exposures are or how they can achieve the avoidance, or they are still in love with their smartphone or their computer or whatever it may be. But it just seems to me, if we considered this any other type of a poisoning, and I don't know whether that's legitimate, you can comment on that, but if we considered it as some type of a poison, like lead poison, and you'd managed to get all the lead out of your body, how much more lead would you take, voluntarily after?
Yeah.
So,
No, I agree. And that is actually a problem. I meet very often people that have done a lot, and then they still would expose their baby to a wireless baby alarm, and themselves to a laptop and a cell phone and so on. And often even not realizing what we're talking about. I remember, for instance, a nurse at the big Stockholm hospital. She was the head nurse of that department. And I had a friend there, and we were going to look for a room with low background radiation levels. And we asked her if she knew by her experience if some of the rooms were more shielded from radiation. And she said the following: radiation? No, 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 no. This is a department of hematology. We don't have any radiation. That's the radiology department where they do x-rays and that kind of things. No, I said, we're talking about the non-ionizing radiation that your cell phone is using. And then she took her cell phone up and said, I always wondered how they work. She didn't understand how they communicated with and in this case, a hidden base station under the roof plates. So she couldn't really help us because she didn't understand the technology, and she was super smart. She did help us later on with a lot of things, but that particular thing had not sort of been understood by her.
Somehow we have to improve our ability to to educate the medical community, because, when people aren't feeling well, the first place they go is to see a doctor. And as we've already discussed, they're often unable, maybe always unable to draw the conclusion of what the problem really is. Well, always is probably too much of a stretch, but yeah, we must figure out how to solve that problem. But I have noticed in the people that I work with who seem to be doing the best in recovering their lives, the two characteristics that I see. So if I had a metric, again, I'm not a doctor or anything, but if I had two characteristics to look at, I would say you're doing well as a sensitive individual. In other words, you have you're practicing avoidance successfully in your life. If your resilience, your recovery after exposure, is decreasing or improving, in other words, the time to recovery is less, and your sensitivity is decreasing, meaning that you're able to withstand tolerant exposures that you were no longer able. What do you think of this idea?
No, that sounds very, very smart. And what I see is that each electrohypersensitive person, they have their own profile. Some, go down in the subjective symptoms very shallowly, and they also have a short distance to come up to near normal. Some go very deep, and therefore it takes a long time, months or even years, sometimes not at all, to come back to near normality. But the word near normality is very important, because it's like a peanut allergy person who, of course, after some time identifies the culprits and don't eat peanuts in any form. They don't expose themselves to that. But that doesn't mean they are not any longer peanut allergy persons. They are, but they have a behavioral tolerance. And that's the same with electrohypersensitivity. People learn to identify environments and situations where they should not go into it. And for me, this has been very interesting, because and maybe, as you say, it's maybe to go a bit far, but I like it anyhow. I think that the electrohypersensitive people, with their avoidance behavior to colossal exposures, they are actually the new normals.
Mm-hmm.
And people like myself, being electrohyposensitive, we are the unlucky fellows here, because maybe we would sit in a situation for years not feeling anything, and in the long-term run instead get, as we talked about before, leakage of the blood-brain barrier, leakage of the blood-testis barrier, if you're a woman that is pregnant, leakage of the blood-fetus barrier, etc. And you don't feel it in the same way, and you keep on sitting there working or exposing yourself to whatever you have, being electrohyposensitive. So the electrohypersensitive, they are the new normal, I would say.
I'll just mention in passing, anecdotally, when I took my avoidance to the next level and designed and built a home that excludes all forms of synthetic, or minimizes all forms of synthetic exposure. My wife and I have been married for many years, and she was very supportive, but she would tell you, I'm not electrically sensitive. And now, after several years, would you believe, she is often the first one to get sick. And she'll come home and she'll say, I had to go to a meeting with these ladies, and they all had their cell phones, and my head was... So it's very interesting. And it's not only me. I've talked to other people who have had that experience where one spouse had the sensitivity, and so they needed to go to an area where they could practice avoidance, and the other one begins to, when they go into a heavy exposure again, realize the difference. I'm not trying to make a case for it, just sharing that anecdotally. And
I can only agree with you. I have exactly the same experience, and also the other way around. We were able many years ago to borrow a shielded cubicle, a huge installation underground, which was basically shielded to all forms of electromagnetic fields. And we brought normal healthy volunteers as well as electrohypersensitive people there. We didn't tell them what kind of a room it was. And they just sat down. I think they sat like for 30 minutes. And then we interviewed them in the way we said, okay, how did that feel? And everyone said, oh, I don't know what to say. It was like something was lacking. And that was exactly what it was. And it's so interesting, because as you know, you can take, for instance, birds in very advanced laboratories and expose them to electromagnetic fields or remove the natural fields, and that would jam their ability to maneuver and navigate. And again, you are removing or adding something that is completely invisible to also a bird's eye and brain, but still they sense it, they feel it. And I remember myself, I went down into this cubicle, and that was so odd to sit there. Of course, I did know what was going on, so I'm not a good test person, but wow, was there something lacking? Yes, indeed. So, and I'm nearly forgotten, just a few days ago, Daniel Favre and myself have published a new article about honeybees. And again, to make a long story short, they are very dependent on a type of natural electromagnetic fields called Schumann resonances. If you remove them, then suddenly a lot of bad things happen, especially with the honeybee queen, who doesn't lay any fertilized eggs any longer. So they need the natural fields to feel okay. And it's interesting because you know that the same you can say about, for instance, sounds. People get extremely stressed if you don't give them natural sounds. If it's completely soundless, that's extremely stressful to the whole organism, as is also, of course, a lot of extra sound. And for instance, when people come here, they often say to me, oh, how can you live here? It's such a terrible sound commotion from outside. And what they hear, and which I don't hear after 50 years in this flat, is the underground trains. So they are sensitive to the variation in their life, and I don't even hear them. I never hear them, And so
so
every
there are,
type of exposure, if it's natural, it's fine for you. If it's non-natural, not so good.
I talk to many people who are aware or just beginning to be aware of their sensitivity. And unfortunately, a lot of people in their quest to get information about how do I restore my old life is what most of them want first. And then there's this detour with harmonizers and scalar energy devices and crystals and diodes and stickers and, endless array of, if you buy this, you can continue poisoning yourself in the way that you always have, but it'll be okay. So what are your thoughts about this?
Well, this is so cynical to sell things like this, including crystals, pyramids, and whatnot. And of course, they don't do anything to protect you. And they instead rob you of some money, sometimes very much money, actually, because some of these things are very expensive. And it's very cynical to fool people into exposing themselves to something that scientists have shown you should not expose yourself to. And again, if you look on shielding gadgets, only the ones that follow textbooks in physics will work. The rest not. So don't go into that alley, that it's very dark and you will just be scammed by ice cold salespersons.
Would you agree with the statement that in order to practice effective avoidance, if the steps that you're taking result in a measurable reduction to one of these phenomenon, AC magnetic fields, AC electric fields, radio frequency radiation, or the dirty electricity, if it results in measurable reduction, this can be very good. But if it doesn't result in measurable reduction, this is not effective avoidance. Would you agree with that?
I would agree, but I would also be careful, as you say, to always make standardized control measurements using equipment that is sensitive enough. But as you say, if you don't see any reduction or even an increase in exposure, that's a warning flag. But if you can see a reduction, that's a good first step. But I see that sometimes you need to go quite far down on the exposure level, and most often your own body is also important to ask, do I feel okay or not? Because you can have a numerical reduction, but it's still too much. I mean, we talked about a quintillion times higher, and even if you go down 1,000 times, it's still biblical and colossal, So maybe you need to go much, much, much further down. And I see that when people report feeling healthy, and that could take, as we said before, quite some time, weeks, months, even years. That coincides with that they have changed their exposure situation to I would call it an extremely low exposure situation, but it's personal. Some people need just a bit of reduction to feel better, and some need a lot. And as we said before, I have had these, should we call them odd calls? I remember a woman who called me and said, "Oh, I have become electrohypersensitive. I worked as a secretary. I was sitting at the computer day out, day in, and now I'm severely electrohypersensitive. And that is the best that has ever happened to me." And I thought, what? No, she's kidding me. You see, she said, I had to move from the city out on the countryside. I have always dreamt of having golden retriever dogs, and now I have 3 of them. And she kept on like this. So she saw her new sensation, her sensitivity, as God's given gift, and she was happy and beaming with happiness. But most people, they don't beam. They are in a very tough situation, and they need to stay at their workplace or at their home. They have children, etc. And electrohypersensitivity could really work as a wedge between man and woman, between the spouses, between children, and so on. So you need to be, especially as a medical doctor, need to be very supportive and not try to solve anything if you can't, because the accessibility measures here, they are for technicians, electricians, building biologists, that kind of people. Medical doctors, they can treat symptoms, of course. If you have a severe headache, they can give you a prescription on aspirin, but they cannot do anything about your computer. You need a specialist in that. And as you said before, always monitor the changes technically, but trust your body. So that's really and when it comes to exposures, as you said before, the reading could be the same, but maybe you have changed the information content in the form of pulsations and polarizations, etc. And that is actually doing the trick. So it's it's not self-evident and it's not easy to do, but start with the technical reductions and then ask the person, how do you feel?
Yes, exactly. So I have this concept of exclusion facilities. You know, in the medical world, I think they have two kinds of challenges: a provocation study and then a exclusion study. So a very simple idea is if you think you're having problems with wheat, then you could give somebody a whole bunch of wheat and see how they react, or maybe better to just withhold the wheat. So I think it would be wonderful if worldwide people could not spend any money on having somebody come in and assess their home, or spend any money, certainly on harmonizers or any of that stuff. But if they could go someplace and be away from the synthetic exposures, it used to be possible to just tell people, go camping. And if you had any kind of terrain available, terrain protects against radio frequency radiation in certain circumstances. And so that would be a good thing. But now so many campgrounds have Wi-Fi service, and people bringing Starlink devices into those campgrounds and whatnot. So what do you think about the vision of if we one day had exclusion facilities where people could, like a short-term vacation rental, could spend a week in an environment where there were, and we would need some kind of a certification, I think, to say that it is without, that the measured intensities are shown.
It's a brilliant idea. Yeah, it's a brilliant idea. And there are already retreats where people go to get away from Wi-Fi exposure, Bluetooth exposure, cell phone exposure, and so on. The problem with such retreats is that they are very expensive. They could easily cost 5 or 10,000 Swedish crowns per week. That would be I mean 5,000 to 10,000. Yeah, that would be in dollars. 5,000 to 10,000 per week in dollars, American dollars. So it's only for the super rich to really use these facilities. But from a governmental point of view, to inaugurate what we call white zones could be very good. But then while you are there, your own home, as well as your workplace, your place of leisure, should be made accessible for you by using the removal, the distance, the shielding characters. And that doesn't happen most often, so you will come back to the same bad situation again. And therefore, from a handicap politics point of view, it's not recommended to even try to construct such kind of reservations for electrohypersensitive people, because what they should be done is that the entire society should be made accessible. And the United Nations is very strict on this. They talk about that every human being is entitled to live an equal life in a society based on equality. Not in any like campground reservations or expensive retreats or white zones and so on. Anyone should live in the public domain as well as anyone else. And there we have a lot more to do. But again, as I said, if some Swedish inventors now come up with tomorrow's green, human, and environmentally friendly technology, then Sweden will be more rich than any other country in the world, So that would be very good. So I hope someone is listening to this and start thinking, could we do it in some other way that doesn't harm humans and not any of the other species?
Yes, that would be the great victory. And a friend of mine, Gary Duncan, shared a term with me, wireless trespass. And I thought, what a clever way to talk to people. Because,
Yeah.
I think the British have this notion in their evolution of their law, the quiet enjoyment of one's home. I hope I have that correct. But we should all be able to enjoy, to have peace in our homes. And unfortunately, if you live in an area with a cell phone service, what it means is you have wireless trespass into your home. And it's involuntary. You don't have to sign. I understand the dangers. Yes, please blast it into my home. It's going to happen to you if you live in an area with cell phone service. And so somehow that needs to change.
Where I sit here with my laptop, if I ask the laptop for Bluetooth services, I get an enormous list because there are 60 flats in this apartment building, and everyone except me, they have it. So I am constantly bombarded, of course. I'm not electrohypersensitive, but I'm still electrohyposensitive, and in the long-term run, maybe I get damage to my immune system, to the DNA, leakage of the blood-brain barrier, effects on the sperm cells, etc. And I didn't ask for it. It's just here all the time. And it's really here all the time, because if I wake up in the middle of the night and check, it's basically the same list. They are transmitting 24/7 these different gadgets, and that could be anything. It could be wireless speakers, it could be wireless headphones, it could be anything using Bluetooth. If I switch to other sources like Wi-Fi, it's an even longer list. And if I go for cell phone services, I will then pick up all the base stations around this building. So yeah, it's and it's all non-natural. It wasn't before here. And for instance, when I was born, practically nothing of this existed. There were a few radio stations in Sweden, and TV was not even around. It came after a few years, and that was practically it.
Yes, the troubling thing about this is you and I can remember a time when the world felt much different, or at least I could discern the difference. And I don't think you can exclude the possibility that you would notice the difference if you could go back to that time. But anyway, people born after a certain period of time, their body has never experienced a time without these, I'll just say, synthetic exposures. So,
nowadays, if you look upon babies that are born, they have been exposed from the moment they were born. They were exposed for 9 months in the womb. They were exposed as sperm cells and egg cells, and they were exposed as progenitor cells to the sperm cells and to the egg cells. So, wow, that's a completely different life than you and I had, and again, as we know, when you look in the scientific literature, there are so many important papers, and for every day more and more are published, pointing to that the insurance companies have done the right thing 30 years ago, just abandon ship.
Right. Well, Olle, you are doing a lot of work for a retired man.
Oh, thank you. Today I've been actually vacuum cleaning,
Okay. You published a paper not very long ago, I don't know, maybe 2 months ago, bacterial, what was it? Super bacteria developing in an EMF environment, and you have one that you've just published on the bees. And sorry, I can't remember the name of that first one, but I'm just saying that you're quite busy still in doing this work, and you make time from your busy schedule to talk to me. And I know you're active in giving lots of different interviews. I just want to encourage people that you are still doing research and you're still quite active in this area. And there is a way I would like to ask people if you would consider supporting the efforts. There is and I'll leave this in the description, research.radiation.dk, Delta Kilo, research.radiation.dk. And each of you listening to this can have the opportunity to help make his work continue. So is there anything?
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Any final words? Anything else that you'd like to share before we sign off?
No. I think we touched upon quite a few of the different results that are discussed around the world. And just to conclude, you mentioned the effect on bacteria, which is the most scary part, actually. And scientists, several different research groups have done this, and they exposed ordinary bacteria that we have on us and in us right now while we speak. And they exposed them to the second generation mobile telephony or to super modern Wi-Fi routers. And to make a long story short, and others have done the same studies but with soil bacteria. And what happened was that the bacteria getting these colossal exposures turned into antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And during the recent COVID-19 pandemic, a representative of the World Health Organization in Geneva in Switzerland, he was asked by a reporter if COVID-19 was the greatest threat to mankind. And then he kind of wryly smiled and said, no, we can cope with that. We will come up with solutions to it. But the reporter was smart. So he asked, but what is the biggest threat to mankind? And then this official from the WHO said, oh, well, that's easy to answer. That's antibiotic resistance in healthcare. And then when I heard that, I kind of froze, because I realized that this man or the reporter, they didn't know that already scientists have shown that household ordinary exposure levels, not anything extra, will turn bacteria antibiotic resistant. And if that will happen on a bigger scale, which it is already doing, and the WHO even calls it a medical tsunami, then people soon will start dying from a splinter in their finger, as we did at the end of the 1900th century. And that is scary, I would say, and I do hope that all these scientists are wrong. And being like a mental fire brigade soldier, I want to be wrong, actually. I want to come to the place and find out there isn't any fire, there isn't any danger. But again, as I said, every morning when I wake up, there isn't any new data pointing into the green sector. It's just another paper pointing into the red sector instead. So I do hope more people will realize, as I said before, that the manufacturers, operators, and insurance companies, they are the ones with the real precautionary principle. They just skipped any form of responsibility.
Which leaves us holding the bag. So
yeah, indeed. We are left on the ship together with our politicians and civil servants, and they do, at least here, nothing. And this is just going on. And, we talked about honeybees and bumblebees and so on. It's a dramatic loss. Canada had lost more than 90% of their honeybees. The United States, more than 90% of their bumblebees, 75% of their honeybees. Europe in general, around 75%. And if you look, for instance, on the Swedish farming landscape, which used to be like a checkered board, it's in August only one color, and that is from oat, wheat, barley, and that kind of things, because they are wind pollinated. So the farmers have skipped all the other crops because there are no insects any longer, and they just go for making wheat and barley, and you can make oatmeal and you can make bread. So, but no fruit, no vegetables, no nuts in the future. And I'm surprised when I go in the Stockholm Underground that not every human being stands up and screams in horror, because that's what they should do, actually. But they
People
don't.
don't.
They
Yeah,
are just, yeah, I guess they don't realize what is happening, but it's happening fast, very fast.
it is happening very fast. And I think I'm correct in saying that there are patents where radio frequency radiation is used to kill insects. And now we're deploying it
Yeah,
broadly.
and to damage DNA. Yeah,
Yeah,
you can
right. And
use you can use the cell phone radiation in experiments in laboratories to damage the DNA. And no one says, well, what happens outdoors? And we know what happens outdoors. The DNA is also damaged. Again, no one stands up and says, stop. We cannot allow this. The show just goes on,
yep, I'm with you. So I live in the forest, and yet we have
And
cell phone.
what I always tell people is, yeah. And what I always tell people also is that when you die, maybe there is a pearly gate and a St. Peter. And I don't want him to tell me that, Olle, why didn't you speak up? You saw and understood, like Arthur Furstenberg. Why didn't you speak up? And I did speak up. So maybe he will say, Olle, you did your best. You failed, but you did your best anyhow, That's enough for me. And I'm surprised, as I say, that not more people scream.
To whom much is given, much will be required. Maybe one day we'll hear, well done, good and faithful servant.
Yeah.
Ulla, thank you so much for all that you do, all that you have done.
Or the opposite, maybe when I come to the pearly gates, it will say sponsored by Ericsson Telecommunication,
And you can take national pride in that, at least.
oh, national pride, but I will still go down,
Yeah. Ulla, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate
Well,
it.
thank you.